Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about Too Many Curses by A. Martinez. Okay, so this book was recommended to me by a subscriber, and yes, congratulations! You succeeded in predicting my tastes pretty much exactly. This is exactly the kind of book that I like, with the light, silly writing and a soul underneath. So Too Many Curses is the story of Nessie. She is a kobold, which is a small furry dog-like creature, and she works as basically the curator of the castle of this evil wizard named Margle. She spends her days cleaning, organizing, taking care of the cursed residents, and being threatened with horrible fates by Margle himself. All wizards in this world are collectors by nature, and Margle has not just collected gold, silver, magic books, gems, magical objects, dangerous beasts, weapons, but he's also collected his enemies. He almost never kills his enemies, he just turns them into bats, or disembodied voices, or stone gargoyles, or traps them in paintings, and then he keeps them around his castle like trophies. But when Margle meets a gruesome end, Nessie's problems have just begun. First of all, as soon as it gets out that Margle is gone, other wizards will flock to this castle to basically steal his collection. But also, there are a few inhabitants of this castle who are going to be not exactly easy to control without the powerful wizard's magic. And of course, there's also just the fact that evil wizards rarely stay dead. Okay, so yeah. I really like this book. It's silly, it's fun, it's got this overall comedic tone, and it's one of my favorite kinds of ways for comedy to be presented in a book. It's got just this silly world with odd inhabitants, but they are treated seriously by the narrative and by each other. Nessie spends her days with a bat with a bad Scottish accent, the monster under her bed who just wants her to read to him, a gambler who was turned into a cat when he lost a bet, and honestly now seems to prefer being a cat, and a dead man who has been separated into his mad skull, and his kind, helpful, and of course, silent body. But this book does not make fun of any of these ridiculous characters. The book takes them seriously, and mostly the other characters take them seriously, which allows us to get actively attached to them as characters. They aren't just passing gags. The comedy here isn't in these quick, biting jokes, though there are a few of those in the book as well. No, overall, the comedy is in just the sheer ridiculousness of the situation and the people who are trapped in it. Now, that does mean there aren't many, in my opinion, laugh-out-loud moments in this book, but honestly, I rarely laugh out loud when I'm reading anyway. Like, books just don't hit me that way. And there are more than a few chuckles here. And of course, what I am looking for in comedic books, even more than the actual humor, is the heart. Like, yeah, I enjoy laughing. I will watch comedy specials. But you aren't going to keep my attention across 300 pages with jokes. The emotional core of the story is what's going to keep me in the book. And this one definitely has heart and soul. The characters are all given, like, enough depth that, you know, you can really actually care about them. There are some really lovely little emotional arcs throughout the book. Though one thing that I really only ever see in these comedic fantasy books, but I see consistently in comedic fantasy books, is the rhythm of the story is really episodic, and especially in the emotional arcs. There'll be these little short segments of basically a short story within the much longer story. And, like, there are dozens of minor characters, many of whom get their own little separate emotional arcs. Sometimes they'll come back, a couple of them appear in the climax, some of them appear in the falling action. Some of them honestly never reoccur. They just have their short little emotional arc and we move on. And that's something that's very common to this kind of book. And I like it, and I feel like it's really difficult to do well, and I feel like this book did do it well. But in the end, it comes across a little bit like reading a series of short stories that are all building towards one climax. And this is something that I see in, like, Discworld books, and I remember from a lot of the specifically comedic fantasy that I read in the late 90s, which was the last time I was reading a lot of comedic fantasy. And I don't know why this is such a staple of this genre, but I like it, so it's not like I'm complaining. But there's also just a continuing character arc throughout the entire book that does feel strong and emotional, and specifically there are two of them. There's Nessie's arc and there's Sarah Thaddeus's arc. Neither are exceptionally complex emotional arcs. Like, Nessie's is mostly just learning to stand up for herself and demand the respect she deserves. And Thaddeus's is about him transitioning from just pretending that he is still the hero he once was, to acknowledging that he feels diminished, to realizing that the curse does not define him and he can still be the hero he always was. And these are both pretty simple, pretty straightforward. Honestly, a little bit, like, for lack of a better word, childish arcs. Like, these are things you see a lot in young adult and middle grade books, and there's not much subtlety here, but there doesn't need to be. Especially considering the thing about comedic fantasy books is quite often there's so many layers of things going on that the emotional arcs don't really need to be incredibly subtle. They sort of need to be in your face to give you the through line to pull you all the way through. And combined with the sheer readability of this book, yeah, it does come across a little bit young adult. But personally, that's something I like. When I was a kid, one of my favorite genres to read were the fantasy novels that sort of, like, crossed the line between young adult and adult. They read like young adult, but they didn't have the themes of young adult. They had the themes of adult novels. And that gives the books a certain levity to the story, and also this sort of light, hopeful feeling, even when the books are being dark and serious. And yeah, this is one of those books that has some gruesome, violent shit in it. One of the characters is literally floating body parts in a jar. One of the antagonists can kill with a touch. But it still feels light and playful. And part of that is the fact that Nessie is just so damn blasé, calm, and unbothered about everything. There's a shadowy doom beast roaming the castle trying to eat the partially dead, and Nessie is really just annoyed that it's leaving brimstone footprints everywhere. Like, yeah, she cares about these people. She will, like, try to fight for them, but what she's thinking in the moment is, damn, those footsteps are going to be hard to clean up. And another part of that is that, like a lot of these comedy fantasy books, it's all taken so far that it circles around from horrifying straight back to just plain silly. And that feeling that these horrors are ultimately just a bit silly also works towards the overall themes of the book. And of course, this is me. I'm going to want to talk about the thesis and themes of this book. I even made a short about the thesis of this book because there's a point about halfway through, or a little bit over halfway through, it's page 202, where this book just literally straight up states its thesis statement. Okay, so... The fate of the universe didn't rest in the hands of giants. It could be found in the littlest things. Anything done well was a worthy accomplishment, whether it be unwrapping arcane secrets or sweeping halls, raising kingdoms from the ocean or washing dishes. All tasks, great or small, were of equal importance in the end. Without peasants, there could be no kings. Without soldiers, there was no army. And there's a lot more complexity going on here than just that simple, straightforward thesis statement. This book is also saying a lot of things about compassion being what breeds goodness, about not letting things that are wrong with us define our abilities, about building our own prisons. But the core thesis here is one about little moments, little gestures, little choices, and seemingly little people being what shapes the world. And it's really well woven throughout this story. From chapter 1, when Margul is ultimately defeated by a polished floor, up until the final climax, we are shown this theme in every way possible. In individual character arcs, in overarching plots, in the little, almost standalone scenes, in character dialogue. Even just Nessie as the protagonist illustrates this theme. She is physically small, a servant, and someone who does not think of herself as, you know, exceptional or powerful or heroic. Her defining characteristics are competency and compassion. And I don't know why this detail stuck with me, but early on in the book, the author tells us that the kobolds are uncomfortable under open sky, and the way he describes it is really actively funny. Like, it is one of the moments that made me laugh out loud in this book, so I don't want to ruin it for you, but it boils down to the fact that they are too unimportant in the eyes of the gods. And that's one of those details that even when it is presented as a joke, it is so damn resonant to the overall theme. There has never been a kobold wizard because they don't see the point in doing these ridiculous big things. In contrast to the wizards in this world, who are defined by doing these ridiculous giant big things just because they can. They shrink cities into bottles, they collect monsters, they make deals with demons, even knowing it will condemn them to the worst of torments, because they see the worst of torments as the best, as long as it is special for them. This book is an absolute middle finger to men who imagine themselves as giants, who imagine themselves as the center of the universe, more important than everyone else, because they have the strength, wealth, and connections to carve their names into mountains. And yeah, that is something that feels so pointed and relevant to the modern world. I do not know, and cannot know, who A. Lee Martinez was thinking of when he wrote Margall as this hoarding wizard who thinks that everyone should cower before him, but I know I had some people in my mind while I was reading this. And I would also like to note that he chose to make his protagonist female. In many ways, Nessie is the living embodiment of how women and the work that has traditionally been assigned to them in our culture are often undervalued or downright ignored. Margall pays absolutely no attention to Nessie, except to berate her when things are not done the way he wants. He never notices how much she affects the world around her. He never notices how smart she is. He never notices the differences she's made in the castle, and I mean that both, subtly, but also not so subtly. He thinks of her as replaceable, up until the moment she replaces him. And there's also, Echo, who has been reduced to nothing but her voice. And then there's also the two most powerful other characters in the book are female, both of whom have been locked away because Margall realized they are too powerful for him to control. Basically what I'm trying to get at here is this author clearly thought about gender when he was writing this book, and I think he did a great fucking job of it. But there's one other thing that I need to discuss here, and that is Dan. I'm not 100% sure how I feel about decapitated Dan. He's a madman, and that's literally what he's defined as in the book. That is his description. In life, he strangled several people to death. He liked to howl until his throat gave out. He didn't sleep and instead spent all night staring up at the sky. His madness is never defined. It's never associated with any real-world mental illness, but it is associated with magic and supernatural understanding. He can understand the whispers of the castle even when no one else can. He makes a prophecy that at least some of which comes true. So I have these really complex feelings about him. He's interesting, honestly funny, and I mostly just enjoyed reading the character, but every now and then as I was reading, there would be this weird little twitchy feeling in the back of my head of, is this romanticizing mental illness? Or demonizing mental illness? Or both? And I'm 99% sure that my answer here is no, it was not. And specifically because the character is never associated with any kind of real-world diagnosis. This book very carefully never uses real-world medical mental illness terms. And also, more than that, he's not showing us the symptoms of a real-world diagnosis. And I think that that provides the separation we need to avoid promoting the narrative that mental illness shouldn't be treated because it gives magical insight or creativity. And also it avoids the demonization of people with real mental illnesses that could have easily stemmed from the fact that Dan is a chaotic, evil monster. But I don't know. I will admit the magical madman is one of those tropes that I've always just enjoyed reading, even though I know it's problematic. So I might be making excuses just because I enjoyed it and I enjoyed Dan, and we tend to make excuses for things we like. But yeah, so if you're reading this book, do be aware that if you find the magical madman trope a problem, it appears in this book. It's a very big part of this book, but I personally think it's done in a not so problematic way. But overall, I found this book a really light, fun read with a beautiful and well thought out message. I found the characters fun, I found it funny and moving and sweet and thoughtful in turn. I was really worried it was going to stumble at the climax because I know what it was trying to do is a very difficult thing to try to do and to get right. That story where the ending is built up from dozens of seemingly random things that come together right at the right moment, while also leaving the main character some agency. And I feel like this book did not stumble. I really liked the ending, though I suspect some other readers might find it a little bit saccharine. But for me, what kept the ending from feeling too optimistic and sweet and pat is one line. In the moment of darkness, before we see the light at the end of the tunnel, we get this line. But in a world without justice, perhaps vengeance was all one could hope for. And I just really fucking appreciate a book that looks at the option of just raging against the horrors of the universe and raging against injustice, acknowledges its flaw, its strengths, its catharsis, and instead still chooses love and kindness. It reminds me of the person I want to be, and it was exactly the ending I needed to read at that exact moment. So yeah, I really appreciated that book. Now, on to read something significantly angrier. Woot.